Good evening, Louise. Today I'm going to attempt to discuss the nature and structure of the slave plantation society across the Caribbean. In order to fully do so, I am first going to delve into the provenance of slavery and the fundamental tools and figures that enabled it to happen to give you an initial idea of the subject area. During the 15th century, European empires were constantly looking at ways to develop and expand their economy and power, with many believing that a free workforce was the most profitable way to do so. The general perceptions of the Africans by the Europeans at this time was that they were inferior to themselves in most aspects, therefore making them an easy target. The argument that they were inferior was used to help justify slavery in the 1600s, and in 1632 King Charles bought into these views and granted a licence for the transportation of slaves from England for the very first time. With the monarch's acceptance, the malicious endeavour was enabled to proceed in Britain. Although Portugal was first to conjure slavery, Britain soon dominated, with thousands of people from all social classes partaking in the venture. The triangular trade shown here describes the system of trade used by the Europeans to maximise profits during the era of which slavery was rife. Firstly, using Britain as an example here, slave ships would leave ports like London, Liverpool and Bristol for West Africa, carrying goods such as cloth, guns and drink that had been produced in Britain. These goods would then be later used to trade for men and women slaves captured by the infamous slave traders in Africa. The slave traders would capture the slaves by many means, using force and tranquilizers often. Once in Africa, European traders would select their prey and enslave them, whilst they sailed along the coast looking for the cheapest and fittest slaves until they were enough to fill a ship. Families were unfortunately separated at this point, causing much distress and heartache. Segregating families was also a strategic measure, as it helped in the process of emotionally breaking down individuals, resulting in a less likely chance for a revolt. Once the ships were full, they would sail across what was known as the Middle Passage, where brutality and cruelty beyond measure took place, alongside inhumane conditions such as these on the ships. A staggering 2 million Africans, that's 10 to 15%, died during the Middle Passage. Once the ship approached the Caribbean, the slaves were often prepared through many methods, such as being washed, shaved, and even covered in oil to give them a healthier appearance to increase their value price. However, no amount of grooming could disguise the harrowing sight of skin and bones that stood before them. Depending on where they arrived, the slaves were often sold through auctions or by a scramble, which entailed buyers literally grabbing whoever took their eye. Sales often involved measuring, grading, and an intrusive physical examination, degrading them even further. Post-auction, slaves were often branded and given a new name, which was often English. These processes, alongside the separations of families mentioned earlier, helped to strip them of their identity, culture, and willpower, making them completely reliant and subservient to their new masters. They were then seasons, which is the word used to describe the period of time in which they were trained to endure the back-breaking new labour and the unbearable working conditions. Individuals were often split into two systems, the gang system and the task system. The task system was more desired of the two, as it included more privileges and freedom. Individuals would be allocated to a specific task at the start of the day, and once completed, were free to indulge in their own activities, which may include growing crops for themselves, making things for themselves and their families, or even making things to sell. Task work was set according to different crops and was most commonly used in coastal Georgia and South Carolina, where rice cultivation took place. In the gang system, individuals were allocated tasks according to age, sex, gender, and strength. Age did determine when the enslaved would enter the workforce, but again, to maximise profits, children as young as 6 would be set to do tasks of what they were physically able. The gang system usually comprised of 3 individual gangs: the Great Gang, which consisted of those only of the greatest strength and stamina; the Second Gang, which was composed of many people with weakly habits such as breastfeeding mothers and strong but elderly, and youths from 12 years age above. Then finally there was the Third Gang, which was otherwise known as the Weeding Gang, as it mainly consisted of young children ranging from 5 to 12 who were often set to do the most inferior jobs such as weeding. The gang system entailed disturbingly long hours of physical labour, alarming working conditions, and the most torturous pain inflicted on them that one cannot bear to think of. These brutal beatings often didn't take place by a white person, as one would think, but of a man of their own race who was given the position of a driver or overseer, given implements such as this one, to inflict barbaric wounds on a slave if they were perceived as not working hard enough or stepping out of line. Not only was there a driver for the adults, but there was also one for the children. These dominant positions were only given to the most loyal and trusted slaves, as were the jobs of domestic duties in the household. The idea of a promotion, as it will, would have motivated the slaves to work harder and to be more obedient in order to move up in the hierarchy. In some instances, a slave owner could go through the process of manumission, allowing their slave to gain their own freedom. Alaudo Equiano was one of these slaves. From trading on the side, in just 3 years he earned enough money to buy his own freedom. He was an influential and inspiring figure who in 1786 became a fundamental figure and driving force towards the abolition of slavery, alongside William Wilberforce, Josiah Wedgwood, and even Abraham Lincoln, using many propaganda devices such as this coin and many anti-slavery pictures such as this one, until eventually, in 1833, the British Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was passed, abolishing slavery throughout most of the British Empire.